Hello, welcome to our next webcast. The title of this webcast is Plant Reproduction. One of the first concepts to think about in plants is that there's this idea of alternation of generation. This idea that there are gametophytes and that those gametophytes produce gametes, and then those gametes, when they come together through fertilization, form a structure called a sporophyte. And the idea is then that structure, sporophyte, produces spores. And those spores can grow into another structure and then, once again, produce gametes. And so it will go in that cyclical way of going back and forth between what's called the gametophyte generation and the sporophyte generation. In mosses and ferns, the gametophytes and sporophytes are actually separate structures. When you get to gymnosperms and angiosperms, the gametophyte is actually on the sporophyte. The sporophyte is the plant. The gametophyte is the reproductive structure of the cone or the flower. We'll talk about that as we go along. So first of all, just to kind of briefly talk about mosses, we're not going to focus on those. In mosses, you can see that there is a structure called the sporophyte, and once again, I'll kind of outline this with the pen. So the sporophytes would be in this part of the chart here. This is a sporophyte generation. And so the sporophyte is really this structure, I'm going to circle it here, that comes up out of the plant, and it's going to release spores. And then those spores are going to go through meiosis and produce the gametophyte. And then in the gametophyte, there's going to be a male gametophyte, and there's going to be a female gametophyte. The male gametophyte is called the antheridium, and it produces sperm. The female gametophyte is called the archegonium, and it's a structure that produces eggs. You can see the eggs in the archegonium right here. You can see the sperm being released from the antheridium right there. The idea is that the sperm from the antheridium fertilizes the egg from the archegonium and produces a zygote, which I'm circling right here, and then that is going to grow up into a new sporophyte. So here's the sporophyte right here. And so once again, it goes back and forth. The sporophyte produces spores. The spores go through meiosis and form gametophytes. Gametophytes release those gametes, sperm and egg. Sperm fertilizes the egg and grows a new sporophyte. And so the idea is the sporophyte and the gametophyte are separate structures. They're together kind of within the moss. Most of what you think of as moss, the carpet that you'll see on a rock or on a tree or in dirt or whatever, is actually the gametophyte part of that plant. I'll show you in some pictures coming up here. These would be, if I circle this on here once again, these would be sporophytes sticking up from the moss, and then down here you have the gametophyte part of the plant. Once again, we're not going to focus on this too much, but we at least want to show you. This one would be a sporophyte of a moss, once again. Okay. In ferns, the sporophyte is the major part of the plant. In mosses, it was the gametophyte, was the green part of the plant. In ferns, the sporophyte is the actual leaves and fronds of the plant. Okay, we talked about this in class before, but on the underneath of the fern leaves, there are often structures called sori, sorus singular or sori plural, and what those do is they release a large amount of spores. And so if we look at their life cycle, those spores are released. I'm going to kind of go back here and circle this. The spores are released from the sporophyte, and then that grows into a structure called a gametophyte. In ferns, that gametophyte is this kind of heart-shaped structure called a prothallus. And on that prothallus, there is an antheridium, once again, okay, right here, and also an archegonium. Once again, the antheridium is going to produce sperm. The archegonium is going to produce eggs. The sperm fertilizes the egg, and that grows into another sporophyte. And that sporophyte becomes what we know as the fern. So like I said, the predominant part of the cycle that we know of as ferns is the actual sporophyte. And the gametophyte is a very small structure that you wouldn't often notice in the dirt that produces that sperm and egg. This just shows another picture. Once again, over here on the left of this page, you're going to have, once again in ferns, this is going to be the sporophyte generation over here in tan. All right. And then in green over here, you're going to have the gametophyte generation. Gametophyte is going to produce sperm and egg. Sporophyte produces spores, just like we've been saying. This is just a picture of prothallus, these heart-shaped structures that are the gametophytes of ferns, and it actually just zooms in on the Antheridium archegonium. Once again, just another picture of that same thing under the microscope. You can see how small it is under the microscope. Here are the sori underneath a fern leaf, so you can see all those structures. And remember, those are the structures that are going to release spores that would grow into that prothallus, that heart-shaped structure that would then produce sperm and egg. So it, once again, cycles back and forth between sporophyte and gametophyte. And then we get into gymnosperms. In gymnosperms, you're going to have the plant itself, once again, is the sporophyte part, and then the actual cones in a gymnosperm are the gametophyte, or the reproductive structures. And you have male structures and female structures now. So you'll have the pollen cone is kind of like the male part that releases pollen, and then that pollen is blown by the wind, right? And then you're going to have female cones. We talked about these in class before, right? And the female cones are going to have eggs inside of it. And the idea is that the pollen from the male is going to fertilize the egg from the female, and that is going to form a seed, which is a big advancement in gymnosperms, having a seed that can sit until the times are appropriate and then grow into a new sporophyte or seedling. Okay, a new tree, okay, for instance, is going to come from that. So once again, the cones are going to produce pollen if it's a pollen cone, or eggs if it's an ovulate cone or female cone. The pollen grains would land on the female cone, form pollen tubes, which would then fertilize, produce sperm that fertilize the egg, and then that fertilized egg is going to grow into a seedling or new sporophyte. So that's the generation that's going on there. Okay, this just shows the sporophyte generations, and it shows the cones on there. The pollen cone is going to produce pollen grains, which is the male gametophyte. The female cone is going to produce eggs, and those eggs can be fertilized by the pollen. Okay, this is just a picture of a pollen cone. All right, and then these are pollen grains that could be either gymnosperm or angiosperm pollen grains, but you notice that they're all different shapes and sizes. They're very species specific. This is a female cone, which you're kind of used to seeing. Here's the two together. Up here at the top, you've got the pollen cone, and down here at the bottom, you're going to have the female cone. So male cones up top, female cones down bottom. Right? And then we get into angiosperms. Angiosperms are going to, their gametophyte is going to be the flower. And so you've got the different parts of the flower. The male part of the flower is the stamen. The anther is the part that produces the pollen, and then the filament just holds the anther up. So the anther and filament together create the stamen. The female part of a flower is called either a carpel or pistil, and it's made of three parts. You have the stigma. I'll kind of outline these a little briefly. You've got the stigma, which is the top. That's what the pollen sticks to from a pollinator. You've got the style, which leads down to the ovary. And if pollen lands on the stigma or is placed there by a pollinator, there are pollen tubes that will form down the style and eventually to the eggs, and where fertilization will occur. You also have the ovary, where the eggs are, like I said, and that's where fertilization occurs. And that's also the ovaries what becomes the fruit that protects the fertilized eggs. Then you also have sepals, which are leaves that will cover the flower before it buds and then support the flower when it does bud. You have petals that are used in some way to attract pollinators, either through smell or color, that sort of thing. So those are the different parts of a leaf. Here are the structures on the diagram that you have. So if we went through these, 1 would be the petals, 2 would be the stamen, 3 would be the style, 4 would be the sepals, 5 would be the ovary, 6 would be a filament, 7 would be the stigma. So those are the different parts of the flower that you have to label. We'll talk about functions in class. This just shows the life cycle real quickly of a flower, so our reproduction in angiosperms. So once again, you've got the sporophyte is the actual plant, the gametophyte is the flower on the plant. And so the anthers are going to produce sperm. So here's an anther. Here's a pollen grain from that. The pollen grains are going to stick on the stigma. The pollen tubes can be formed on the style, and then fertilization can occur in the ovary. And the ovary is what becomes the fruit. The fertilized egg becomes the seeds. And in angiosperms, you have this process of double fertilization. We'll talk about what that is in class. Basically, some sperm are going to fertilize some egg nuclei that are going to become the zygote, and other sperm are going to fertilize other nuclei that will become what's called the endosperm, which is the nutrients kind of within a seed for the developing embryo. Also, a lot of times the food when you eat a seed. This just shows another picture of carpels and sepals and stamen and a flower. This shows a fruit with the seed inside, so you can see the endosperm of the seed, you can see the actual embryo, you can see the seed coat around the seed, and then the fruit around that. Right? Apple, you can see the fruit, and then you can see the seeds inside of it. This is corn, so this is, I'll kind of outline this a little bit, but this is the endosperm of the corn, and this would be the seed of the corn. They're monocots, so they have one seed section to them, right? And that is it for this presentation. We'll talk about this stuff in class. Thank you.